Okay, Russ, I think if you're ready to go, we can kick things off.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Brett?
Can hear you well, yeah.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody, and I want to thank you and all in attendance of this first public meeting. I'm Metropolitan Water District's manager for this grant effort. Would also like to welcome Metropolitan Water District senior management and any board members that are also in attendance. By way of background, just a brief background, the brainstorming of this effort began several years ago with a handful of us sitting around a conference table talking about various opportunities that Metropolitan's islands could provide in meeting certain objectives, which will be discussed later. The CDFW Metropolitan Planning Grant will provide expertise into a science-based planning restoration effort using landscape island-wide approach dealing with land restoration planning. We're also applying a tool referred as structured decision modeling that basically analyzes various elements and applies criteria, value weights, and rankings when comparing various adaptation opportunities. Now, fast forward to 2021 when this grant effort began. In the big picture, all these potential concepts will be consistent with the state's co-equal goal policies, including protecting and enhancing the unique cultural, recreational, natural resources, and agricultural values, along with supporting economic opportunities in the Delta. I'm excited as this is the very first planning grant of this scale, looking at Metropolitan's approximately 20,000 acres. And in the broader vision, as opportunities are brought to implementation down the road, there will be opportunities for further inclusion and collaboration for others to participate in the ideas, concepts, and eventual projects that are resulting from this planning effort. So I want to really thank you for being part of this 18th month effort. This will be an opportunity for the public to input into this process as we lay out all the work efforts that we have done up to date. So Brett, I'll now turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Russ. All right, everyone. My name is Brett Milligan. I am part of the project team. I'm with UC Davis. And what I want to do is start off with letting you know what we're going to do for the next 2 hours. I'm trying to advance my slides. Okay, there we go. So for this first hour, we'll do some welcome and introductions. Then I'd like to provide you with an overview of the project, what's in the scope of the project, the process we're going to go through, the timeline over the next couple of years. Then after that, we're going to go back to Russ, who's going to give you a virtual tour of the 4 islands that are part of this study. And then after that, we're going to talk about why do we need to adapt? Why are we doing this? Why is this project of value? And with that, Steve Deverell is going to give us a presentation on drivers of change in the Delta of why we have to adapt, why things are changing already. That's hour number 1. In our second hour from 5 to 6:30, we're going to give a presentation of 10 draft project objectives that some TAC members have given us some help to initially develop. They are all in a highly draft form, which is why we're coming to you today to seek feedback on those objectives, to help us rate which of those objectives are most important, less important, so forth. Then we will do a short demonstration of a public online survey that we're launching today, which is meant to get your feedback on all of these objectives and to give us more information about them. And then we'll close with an open comment, question and answer session at the end. So I want to put this out there now. Alejo, if you could go ahead and pop this link in the chat, I would appreciate it. So we are launching this public survey now. Hopefully you're going to attend this full workshop, but should you have to go early, we just want to make sure that you have this now. This is a geospatial survey where you log in. Will probably take you about 20 minutes. It will walk you through all of the current draft project objectives, ask for your feedback. It will ask you some spatial questions of where you think certain things should be located, not messed with, all kinds of things like that. So this is for public, conceived in the widest sense. If you're a Californian, you have an interest in what happens to these islands, please do fill out this survey. All of this will be brought into the further planning process of the project. Okay, so we'll come back and give you a tutorial on this later. So just general protocol for this meeting to try to make it successful. Your creativity is highly encouraged. Efficiency is important if you can participate fully without distractions, and civility is required. So if we can abide by these, we should have a very good workshop. In terms of the overall, how this is structured as a webinar, it'll be recorded and we'll make it available on the project website. I'll talk about that in a second too. You can submit questions versus the Q&A at any time during this process. If you haven't done this before, on the bottom, there's a Q&A button and you can type it in there. We've set this up so that all of you should have access to seeing what everybody's asking. So we will try to answer clarifying questions as we go. If there's something we're saying that's not clear, that'll get pointed out and we'll try to address it. But then we'll go through the questions at the end. One other key point, if you've done this before, if you know what upvoting is, so when someone else asks a question, if you really like their question and you really want us to answer that question, you hit the thumb, and that'll mean the more of those we get, let's say 25 people say, we really want you to answer this question, that'll move to the top so that then we can answer those. Okay, so those will be prioritized based on that. And then you can use the raise hand feature, which I think someone just did. We'll get there in a minute. In the Zoom during Q&A, and that's at the end where we'll open it up and then we can unmute you and then you'll be able to talk. Okay, so that's sort of, as a webinar, that's our format. So generally speaking, what are our project goals? What is the description of this project? And Russ already touched on this, so I'll be quick, but we're trying to make progress towards improving the resilience and sustainability of these islands owned by Metropolitan Water District. These lands face adaptations similar to many other reclaimed tracts in the Central Delta, many of which are deeply subsided below sea level and are crucial to meeting the state's co-equal goals of ecosystem restoration, water supply reliability, and valuing the Delta as an evolving place. So we have this information on our project website. There's a little bit more detail about the project description and a bunch of other resources. If you haven't been to this already, it's there for you. We've tried to put pretty much everything on there, our past meetings. We try to put all information on this website as one place where you can go to find everything. So if you don't remember the URL, you can just type in Delta Island Adaptations and it should come up as a keyword search. So this project is funded by a Prop 1 grant through California Department of Fish and Wildlife under the leadership of Hildy Spouts, and those are the other folks from Fish and Wildlife who are also involved in the project. This is our team. Russ, who you heard from, he is the project manager from Metropolitan. And then for hydrology and ecology, we have Steve Deverell, Jose, and Mark from HydroFocus. For structured decision-making, we have Dan Olson and Alon Failing from Compass Resource Management. And then for outreach, co-design, and design integration, that's us. That's myself, Brett Milligan, and Alejo Kraus-Pope from UC Davis in landscape architecture. So we are but a small group of hardworking people on this project. It's much more, hold on, my slide's trying to advance. We have a technical advisory committee, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through everybody on these next couple of slides, but these are a lot of folks from the different agencies, whether regional, state, other organizations that are providing advice and input on the project based on their expertise. And then we also have a group of expert consultants, and these are those folks listed out, whether they're stakeholder or different types of expertise. So all of these folks, these are also considered part of our TAC, are all working and providing input on the project and some of the objectives and how we go about island selection. The project consists of 2 phases, approach through a co-design process. So the first part is which island should we focus on? There are 4. Webb Tract, Bolden, Holland Tract, and Bacon Island. Again, they're all in the Central Delta. So this first part, what we're about halfway into right now, is thinking about which island do we want to select and for what reasons. And that's where we're trying to establish these objectives to think about, okay, which one do we want to focus on? Once one is chosen, we'll then move into a more design-focused phase on one island, looking at different landscape use scenarios or mixed use scenarios. What you'll hear in the next presentation, or two presentations from now, about a landscape mosaic that would be designed for one of these islands. So I threw out the term co-design. If you haven't heard this term before, just generally speaking, that refers to collaborative problem solving and innovation outcomes achieved through an equitable and inclusive design process. It's collaborative in the sense of involving all who might be affected by the design. Collaborative in terms of integrating knowledge from a range of experts and expertise, such as those previous slides I showed, as well as place-based knowledge of residents, landowners, and recreationists. Which is why we're coming to you today. And design here is broadly conceived as intentional and creative ways of bringing about desired change from a given condition, where in this particular context, we're looking at islands that are highly vulnerable and thinking about what do we do in that situation to adapt. So that co-design process is wedded to an engagement and structured decision-making process. So basically the co-design is linked with that of how we do structured decision-making, and all of it is put into a set of sequenced tasks and meetings, which I'll show in a few slides, to try to iteratively work through that. So the idea here is that we're trying to create a transparent and accountable process, trying to be a good neighbor, and trying to integrate multiple objectives and informed choices into how we go about the project. Structured decision-making, if you haven't encountered this before, basically we conceive of it as a learning process, a collaborative learning process where all involved help to set what the objectives are. You do that transparently, and you try to come up with ways to measure if you're meeting those objectives. And then you start going into designing alternatives, thinking about the different consequences of those alternatives, and then you probably iterate that over and over, and you keep refining things as you go until you reach some planning or design schemes that are preferred that you move forward with. So what is in our project scope? This is a big slide, but I'll take a moment here. Everything I just talked about, an integrative co-design process with multiple opportunities for public and stakeholder engagement. We're going to be looking at adaptation scenarios looking 40 to 50 years in the future. We'll also probably be looking a little closer term and a little further out, depending on what we're looking at in specific. We will give full consideration of a no action alternative in contrast to whatever the design alternatives are, so we can see what's different or what might be gained. Evaluation of a wide range of land use opportunities and adaptations targeted towards subsidence reversal, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, sustainable agriculture practices, and ecological benefits. Exploration of opportunities for co-benefits and levee improvements, recreation, water supply reliability, indigenous land stewardship, eco-cultural restoration, and other goals. And consideration of alternatives representing a variety of government, stakeholder, and community interests. So that's in scope. But there's definitely areas where those things are out of scope and that this project doesn't really have sway over. So one of them are water export operation decisions. This project is not part of that process and does not directly affect those. Water quality standards decisions, again, that is decided elsewhere, not here. Levy investment prioritization decisions. Those are also decided elsewhere. That is a larger Delta-wide process, and local area infrastructure planning. So these things are out of the scope of what can be part of this project. So these kinds of questions, if they come up, we will probably have to we won't know the answer, and we'll probably have to tell you that and refer them elsewhere because they are out of the scope of the project. Schedule. So this is for phase one. We started off in November, and just to highlight where we are, we're right here. We've had 2 TAC meetings so far, and the goal of those 2 TAC meetings was to try to get a sense of what are the goals and objectives for how to think about adaptation on these islands in the Central Delta. And that is why we have something basically for you to chew on at this point. It's all very draft. It's all in need of refinement. And that's where we're coming to you as the public to say, you know, what do you think of these objectives as they've been assembled? What do you think about the ways we're measuring them? And I guess most importantly, what do you think is most important or lesser important out of these 10 objectives, which are very wide ranging? So that leads us to where we are today, and that's where we're hoping that you fill out the survey, which is where you'll be able to input your views on that. Then we'll come back, we'll take that information, we'll have another TAC meeting, and then eventually there'll be a decision made. And again, this is just deciding which island to work on. There's work that could be done on all of them. And then this brings us into phase 2, which this is the more detailed design. So what you see here is this would start up probably around fall or September-ish of this after the summer. And you'll see again another series of TAC meetings with 2 more public meetings, number 2 and number 3 there. That is when we'll have spread in there 2 more public meetings for you to input once we actually get into designing on a particular island and looking at that landscape mosaic. Okay. And that's it for an overall intro. And next, we're going to go back to Russ to get an overview of the 4 islands. My screen.
Brett, if I could just for a second, we had a question in the chat, which I unfortunately, there was a request if we could make the participant list viewable to everyone. I'm not sure that's a possibility with this webinar format in Zoom. Alejo is kind of looking into it, but just so we're aware, we're trying to look into how to do that.
Yeah, usually if it were in meeting format, it shows you everybody. Webinar, it doesn't do that. So yeah.
Yeah, so at a minimum, we can keep the list of all participants and share it afterward. But that, unfortunately, I don't think we can make that change as we're started in a Zoom webinar.
Yeah, I'm not seeing an option.
Ready for me to go?
Indeed. Thank you.
Let me bump you out of there. So it's 2. Can you see my screen? As I move this around.
Yep.
Okay, so all that's on, I'm going to provide a virtual flight over each one of Metropolitan's properties, the 4. This video comes as courtesy of Metropolitan, who produced this back in 2016. And you'll hear me interject with certain factors, characteristics, or setting the context of each of these properties. So we'll begin. Welcome to the Sacramento-San Joaquin Rivers Delta, also called the Delta. It is considered the hub of the state's water system. The Delta spans more than 600,000 acres. Waters from the rivers and mountains of Northern California must pass through the Delta to reach people and economies. In 2016, Metropolitan invested in the future of this Northern California water supply. Metropolitan purchased more than 20,000 acres of property, including Bolden and Bacon Islands and Holland and Webb Tracts. In owning these lands, Metropolitan can help to achieve California's co-equal goals to provide reliable water supplies and help restore the ecological health of the Delta. Each island has its own identity and presents its own opportunities to help fix various aspects of the Delta, like habitat restoration, blocking saltwater intrusion with improved levees, and for providing for sustainable farming. Let's take a closer look at each island. Bolden is the largest at about 6,000 acres. As you can see the highway here, it is the most accessible of the islands by way of Highway 12, traversing east to west and west to east. Historically, it has been mostly farmed, with today being mainly corn and alfalfa. From today's farming practices, land subsidence can be seen up to 20 to 25 feet below sea level. This is a common theme for the other three islands as well. The island has important wildlife values. In the winter, Bolden is good foraging grounds for bird species and migrating sandhill cranes, ducks, geese, and other waterfowl species. Bolden is one of the western islands of the Delta that create an important hydraulic barrier to prevent seawater intrusion from entering the Delta and protecting water quality. Here's a good example of subsidence. As you can see, the water surface elevation is much higher than the ground surface elevation. This area is about 10 to 15 or 20 feet below sea level. Next is Web Track at about 5,500 acres. This remote island can only be accessible by boat, barge, or ferry. Web Track is also one of the 8 western islands of critical importance in protecting the Delta from seawater intrusion. There is more wildlife on this island than any of the others. There are 2 riparian ponds created by 2 flood years in the 1950s and the 1980s. Also, land subsidence can be seen up to 20 to 25 feet below sea level. Metropolitan owns about 3,000 of Holland Track's approximate 4,060 acres. A group of private and public entities make up the balance of landowners that farm and provide for grazing lands. The island is only accessed through the county's single bridge to Holland Track. A 1980 flood created this lake that has currently fish and wildlife populations. Similar to Web Track, existing farming adds to land subsidence below sea level in areas of organic soils. Holland Track is strategically located in the Delta to help prevent the influx of seawater into the freshwater corridor. Finally, Bacon Island, adjacent to Bolden Island, is located on the freshwater corridor that runs north and south through the Delta. For more than 30 years, the same family has farmed nearly 4,900 acres of Bacon Island's 5,600 acres. This land has grown a variety of crops over time on this rich organic soil. Similar to Bolden Island, areas of land subsidence can be seen up to 20 to 25 feet below sea level. There are currently 2 bridges leading on and off Bacon Island. The island has significant farming equipment for its operation, as you can see. Thank you. That concludes this virtual tour. Brett?
Yep, sorry about that. I'm still trying to get the list of attendees for everybody. Okay, next we have Steve Deverell is going to give a presentation on the why do we want to adapt? What are the trends? What are the concerns? And why might we be doing what we're trying to do here? Thank you, Russ, for the tour.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm not able to share my screen, my full screen. I'm not sure what's going on here. Hold on a sec.
There you go. We can see it.
I can't get it to go full screen here. I'm not sure.
Does it? We see full
It's
screen.
full screen on here.
Oh, you can see full screen? Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I'm going to talk a little bit about, thanks everybody for being here. Good afternoon. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the motivating factors that led to this project and how this project addresses those factors. I think I would start out with maybe the idea that we could ask a question about what to do about deeply subsided islands. We can see the effect of subsidence here. Russ showed it in his presentation as well, but looking up from Twitchell Island, you can look up on the San Joaquin River and see boats float by, and we're below the draw of the boat. So it gives you an idea of what it's like to be 23 feet below sea level. Just to list the motivators as I see them, subsidence is a big driver. It's stuck on slide one.
Yeah, you gotta use this one.
This works. Can you see the motivator slide?
Yes.
Okay. So subsidence is one of the driving factors, and there's a number of effects of subsidence that are listed there. Seepage is one, and seepage has increased over time as subsidence has proceeded and land surface elevation has decreased. There's been evidence of decreasing ability to farm because of increased seepage. Land gets too wet to farm. There are threats to levees, as I'll talk a little bit about later. And then there are greenhouse gas emissions associated with subsidence due to the oxidation of organic soils. Another motivator here is creating an economically viable situation on MWD's islands. Climate change is another factor here. We're not specifically dealing with climate change except for trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but certainly in the future, climate change is going to result in more extreme events and water quality challenges, as well as challenges to the ecosystem. And of course, last but not least, ecosystem improvement is a key goal for this project. So I'll just mention a little bit about subsidence here. basically in the pre-1880s, there was a freshwater tidal marsh in the Delta. It accumulated about 5 billion cubic meters of organic material during 6,000 to 7,000 years before the 1880s, and was really the result of rising sea levels and the anaerobic decay of organic matter. So basically, we had an anaerobic system that allowed a lot of organic matter to accumulate. Since the late 1800s, we've oxidized most of that, or about half of that organic matter, draining the soils and allowing them to be exposed to oxygen results in microbial oxidation, release of CO2. And then as that occurs, we deepen the drainage ditches and cause compaction as well. So those are kind of the drivers from a subsidence standpoint. And I can just show you an example of subsidence over time on one of MWD's islands, Bacon Island. Walter Weir and associates at the University of California measured the average subsidence on Bacon Island along a transect from the early 20s through the 1970s. Those dots are shown here. And then we added a dot by surveying that same transect in 2006. So you can see the decrease in elevation over time, going from a little less than minus 100 all the way to greater than minus 400 centimeters below sea level. And it continues to subside over time. The subsidence rates on the different islands right now are shown here. Bacon Island is about 1 centimeter per year. Bolden Island is the highest subsidence rate at about 1.5 centimeters per year. Web track is on the order of about 0.6, and Holland is on the order of about 0.45 centimeters per year. One of the consequences that I mentioned was the wet, non-marginally farmable areas, which are increasing over time. Show two photographs on Metropolitan's Island. On Bolden Island, we see this wet area that has evolved over the last decade or so. In this article in 2015, we took a look at from the mid 80s to 2012 to see how these areas have increased in the Delta. Indeed, they have. But you can see that it's really turned into a seasonal wetland because it's too wet to farm. And machinery gets stuck, like this tractor did on Twitchell Island, an area that was too wet. And then we have this area on the east side of Bacon that's also too wet to farm at this point. And it's not uncommon to hear landowners and farm managers in the Delta speak about areas that are becoming increasingly too wet to farm. And it's really the result, in my opinion, of increased seepage on the Delta Islands. If you look at what was the case in the early 1900s, we had very small levees, a lot of organic material, and much of that organic material has, of course, disappeared due to the oxidation. So what happens is that the hydraulics have changed. So rather than having most of the water flow into the organic material, it now flows through high and wide levees, but it also a substantial amount flows under the levees. We call this under seepage. And so that's a factor that we need to consider as we move forward, in that there's a couple of factors here. One is that the areas too wet to farm are the result of this greater movement of water underneath the levee, but there's also the issue of levee stability. So one of the things that the Delta Risk Management Strategy project noted was that this under seepage in the Delta is a prevalent factor that kind of can erode or has the potential to erode the levee foundation material over time. It's a slow process, but it can happen over time, especially as the peat disappears. And here's an example of what that looks like from a just on the ground experience. This is on Jones Track after the failure in 2004. So, and that was cited as likely factor in the Jones Tract failure. So we can see this silty sand and sand that comes from underneath the peat falling into the drainage ditch and kind of bubbling up. So the hydraulic forces are strong enough to move those soil particles into the ditch. And some analysis that we published, a number of us co-authored this paper in 2016 that indicates that the decreasing peat thickness, higher levees can result in higher risk. So you can see that, I hope, in this diagram. The hotter colors represent the higher relative probability of failure, which is proportional to marsh deposit thickness as well as the levee height. So we can see that increasing or ongoing subsidence can reduce the thickness of this marsh deposit thickness, or reduce the thickness of the marsh deposit, as well as increase levee height over time to compensate for sea level rise. So one way to address that is alternate land uses that prevent this subsidence and maintain this marsh deposit thickness adjacent to levels. The 2004 Jones Tract I've already talked about, but it's the most recent example, and actually the only example that we've had in the last couple of decades, but it does indicate the potential for effects of seepage in levees based on the Delta risk management strategy. The greenhouse gas emissions I mentioned are associated with subsidence. We see pretty high greenhouse gas emissions throughout the Delta, on the order of about 1.5 or so tons of CO2 per year. Just on the Metropolitan's Island, Bolden is the highest, but Bacon is close. They're both about 70 tons of CO2 per acre per year, or 70 tons per year of CO2. Holland and Webb are lower, substantially lower, 15 and 20 for Webb and Holland respectively. So alternative land uses are a big part of this project, and trying to fit those into a mosaic that would work on Metropolitan's Delta Islands. We have published data that indicates that rice will stop subsidence. It can also provide a greenhouse gas benefit in some places where we have highly organic soils. This is on Staten Island, where we have some instrumentation set up to measure the greenhouse gas fluxes, as well as measuring the land surface elevation changes. And then permanently flooded wetlands is something we've been looking at since the early 90s. USGS, the DWR started some pilot projects in the early 90s, and this was 97, we started the Twitchell Island pilot wetland. And we've measured accretion there that's on the order of about 3 centimeters per year. And we know that based on the greenhouse gas measurements that have been done through the Delta, this can provide a net greenhouse gas benefit because it stops subsidence, stops the oxidation, and also sequesters carbon. But it doesn't emit methane, but in the overall scheme of things, the data indicates that it's a net benefit over time. And so you can see this, basically what we're trying to do is reverse the downward trajectory. So this is an example on Twitchell Island where we've measured subsidence in corn, about 5 centimeters from 2009 through 2013. And then the wetlands was created. And so we had measurement devices in the same place. And you can see that there's actually been 13 centimeters of accretion as of 2018. So there's this understanding that really creation of wetlands can reverse the downward trajectory. Rice can stop this downward trajectory. And so the mosaic concept came into being soon after Metropolitan purchased the island. We looked at basically an imaginary island in the Delta and thought that, well, we could maybe have permanently flooded wetland with rice and seasonal wetland for hunting, possibly habitat. When we looked at this just from a theoretical standpoint, it looked like greenhouse gas emissions would be reduced substantially. But there's still the economic standpoint. Does this work from an economic sustainability standpoint for any Delta Island? So we delved into that with the Nature Conservancy on Staten Island. This was the baseline condition where it was mostly corn in 2014. And we looked at changing the agricultural mosaic for that island, published that in 2017. And so this is one of the scenarios we looked at that seemed like it had promise. We looked at the economics as well as the greenhouse gas benefit. The greenhouse gas reduction was on the order of about 50%, and the income or the net revenue was about the same as it was for the baseline condition. We accounted for carbon credits for wetlands and accounted for the income from rice. I should mention that it's important to realize the implications of this, I think, in that the island is really a representation of the soil types that are present in the Delta. We have highly organic soils here at the southern part of the island, similar to what's found on the Bolden Island. And then towards the northern part of the island, the organic matter is less. We have less subsidence. So it allows the potential for a mixture of crop types that would result in this greenhouse gas benefit, stop the subsidence or reverse the effects of subsidence, and add more sustainability. And of course, a big part of this is creating wintering bird habitat through a mosaic of upland and flooded habitats. So TNC has a practice, as does MWD on their islands, to try to create habitat for wintering birds by creation of upland and flooded habitats. So I'll turn this over to Dan, but just to say that we're in this process of island selection by looking at different criteria and how they might work on the different islands. The next step is really to develop a mosaic that would be viable for the one Delta Island that's selected using the landscape tool developed by SFEI. We would look at various scenarios and try to, again, go through a public process where we get input on those scenarios. And then that would lead into a pilot project design. So I'll turn it over to Dan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve. We'd like to maybe pause here for a little bit and take a few questions. I also, we had a question earlier that we haven't been able to totally resolve, which is who's at this meeting? So I think someone came up, Dawn came up with a good idea for that. If you go to the chat, and you basically, if everybody could right now just type in your name, make sure you're sending it out to everybody. Those of you who want to be identified as attending this meeting, and then everybody will know who's here. We can't do it through Zoom. So if you would do that, we'll know who's out there. I will go ahead and type mine in as well. There we go. Thank you, everybody.
Great, thanks, folks. And Brett, now I think we're kind of on track or a little ahead of our schedule that we might have thought. So we might want to just at this same time entertain any open questions that people might have. We have a couple in the chat that haven't been addressed yet. So should we turn there?
Yeah, go ahead. I was going to do that next. You want to go ahead?
Yeah, so there was a first part to a question generally around, people are probably seeing it around public access. Russ, you may have answered a previous version of this.
I did.
Okay, and I don't know if you want to take on the second half of that, or if it's a part two question, Francis. Essentially around, yeah, to what extent does the district and its tenants, get involved with managing public access, specifically for the use of the islands for fishing?
So is that the question, the other half of the question?
Yeah, I think you answered the first one, Ryan, Russ, and there's a second.
Typically there's access, in the system for fishing. On Met's properties, we do not encourage fishing because what comes with fishing is the bad element too. We have to maintain liability. There are liability and safety issues on the islands that we monitor from metropolitan standpoint. We also coordinate with the reclamation district to make sure that these islands are patrolled. Just remember, these are bowls in water, and quite honestly, we get leaks here and there. So there's an added safety factor there as well. So we manage it. We do have tours, but we schedule that with our management and senior staff. And but we have had tours out there, but it's more managed in a controlled environment.
And is it fair, is it fair to add to that, Russ, as we're going to move forward, and I'll start speaking about the specific project objectives here shortly. One of them is recreation that we as a project team have been talking about. So is it fair to say that to the extent that this project explores different mosaics, different adaptations that could include different wetland developments as one example, that we will be considering opportunities to explore that?
Yeah, I would say that that's an excellent way to put it. And I also add that, it's not that we don't look at it. We'll look at these opportunities and see if there's a adaptation that makes sense. But with anything, we got to think it through. One of the things that comes to my mind is through the Delta Protection Commission, they came up with the Delta Great Trails, the Great Delta Trails system. And I know was approved at their last January or December board meeting. I think it was December board or the commissions approved it, but they're looking at various regions in the Delta for various reasons. There's different challenges when you start getting down to the southern Delta Islands when they're deeply subsided. There's other things that you really have to take a look at in regards to safety and security, that everybody's recreating safely and it's a safe environment.
Yeah, if I could tack on to what Russ just said there, Dan's going to get into this in his next presentation. We have these 10 objectives, and one of those objectives is specifically about increasing recreational opportunities. And if you go into that survey that we're talking about, there is questions specifically about what types of recreation are most desired. I mean, someone here is speaking, I think, particularly about fishing. There's, fishing from a boat, there's fishing from banks, we're asking those questions. And there's also space in there. There was some notions about, the public right to, the intertidal area and things like that. If you want to point out, there's ways that you can draw polygons in that survey to say, well, I think these are important and I think these should be, considered, or have you can draw a polygon where you think we should consider these things. So one of the goals is with some of the potential restoration that will be done through this process is offering more recreational opportunities across hunting, potentially fishing, recreating, trail hiking along the levee. Those kinds of things are all things that are on the table. So again, please bring those comments into the survey because we'd be happy to answer them. If I can continue rolling, we have another.
Well, let me add one thing too. It's just a taste of reality here. You've got some of these levees that are only 16 feet wide. That's not a lot of room for error there. There's some real narrow areas, but that's not to say that you can't answer that through other adaptations as well. Thanks.
Yeah, there was another question that we had in here. It says, how is the project engaging Native Indigenous peoples and tribes and centering their long history of stewardship of these lands and waters? Another one of the 10 objectives is what we're calling ecocultural restoration, which really has to do with indigenous land management, potentially co-management of these lands, providing access for tribal use of these lands and things like that. And we do have two tribal representatives who are on our technical advisory group. We have Don Hankins and Austin Stevenot, and I know Don's on here. I'm not sure if I don't know if Austin is, but if either of you wish to speak, just raise your hand and we can unmute you. But that is an active consideration, and we are consulting with them about how to best bring that into the project. Did we have any other questions? Alejo, anything we missed?
I think we're caught up for now.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I think we're caught up.
Okay, well, we're well on schedule here. And yeah, I think, Alejo, I see you reposted the link to the survey, which is kind of, you know, as a reminder, as we finish this up, one of the things, as Brett mentioned earlier, that we're very interested in is to get people to weigh in very specifically on the types of questions that are coming in the chat. Like, how important is recreation relative to other things? How important is ecocultural restoration, et cetera? So I will kind of segue into our next topic here and try to share my screen. Let's hope this all works. Is my screen showing up? It's not yet, so I have to go here and do that. There we go. How's that? A little better? Okay. Yes, so I'm Dan Olson, and together with my colleague on the panel here, Alan Failing, we're at Compass, and our role on this project team is, as Brett said, is to support the whole team in taking a structured decision-making approach. So everything that you know, Steve and others have already covered, you know, we're supporting the team to turn that into a structured approach to making choices. And as you know, both Russ and Brett mentioned earlier, well, really standing back for a sec, this is a planning project first and foremost, right? So in its broadest form, you know, there are these 4 blank slates, these 4 islands, and there are things that we want to achieve on them, opportunities that could be taken, and potential adaptations driven by the types of, you know, motivating factors that Steve was talking about. So as we enter into this, we're trying to be very structured. First, about, as Brett said, there's 2 phases to this project. First phase is select an island that gives us the best opportunity to explore some of these adaptations and launch pilot projects. And then second, once we've kind of narrowed down on one island to focus on, and we may have other identified priorities for other islands along the way, but at that same time then get into what Steve was talking about, maybe a mosaic, like different combinations of different approaches to land use into the future. And we'll want to be very structured about how we evaluate those alternatives as well. So all of that kind of fits into this. Let me get my cursor going here. I've just come back to this slide, Brett, that you had earlier, that we are following this kind of stepwise structured decision-making approach. So, you know, we kind of know what the context, what we're doing here. That's what this whole meeting is introducing. And then thinking about everything we've heard already today, we're going to get pretty specific about the objectives. As Brett said, the project team and the Technical Advisory Committee have had a couple of meetings, and we've come up with 10 of them so far. There could be others, and we want people to weigh in on all that. So the objectives is kind of what we want to achieve at the end of the day here. There could be different alternatives, right? Different combinations of these land use activities, different approaches to agriculture, to restoration that could be both for ecological and, you know, indigenous ecocultural benefits. We want to explore all of those in different combinations, estimate their consequences, which means we're going to get specific about this along the way. And then we're going to make choices, under the mandate of the grant that the team is working under. We want to select one of these islands to really roll up our sleeves and work on, and then take another year or more to really come up with different alternative mosaics of land uses. Ultimately, at the end of the day, though, as a planning project, it will come up with recommendations, and those may lead toward implementation of pilot projects, further research and monitoring. And I'll just move to the next slide here. So the objectives, so very simply, I'm going to talk about the objectives that this team has come up with so far and the adaptations. So I'll turn it over to Alan at that point. But the objectives, just think in your mind as I'm going through this with everything you've heard already today. What do we want to achieve in the long term with what we're doing here on these Delta Islands? The adaptations are, what are the innovations that we could explore? Steve mentioned a few of them, rice. There are other opportunities, maybe different approaches to creating and managing wetlands that could have co-benefits. Those are all the kind of adaptations we want to explore. And just to give a glimpse at where some of the materials that might show up down the row, I just threw in this matrix here. So this is kind of the path we're on, that we are going to have these different objectives, and you see them all written down the left-hand side there. These are many of the project drivers. We're trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, protect the water quality and supply, support ecology, et cetera, et cetera. We have all these things that we want to achieve in the long term. And then we have different alternatives. So our first phase of the project is exploring for each of these 4 islands, what are the opportunities to achieve these different objectives? So the team has been working, I've kind of circled here this arrow pointing at the evaluation criteria, which is to tell everyone, if you go to the project website and dig into the last meeting, the technical advisory committee has been working with the project team to come up with specific criteria for each of these objectives. And it's definitely a work in progress. And we have great ideas underway and under consideration right now. So we are actively working on these evaluation criteria so that we can get specific about comparing these islands and comparing the different adaptations that we might consider once we get into the next phase of the project. But if you can envision a matrix like this, not too long in the future from now, filled in with information that helps us really tangibly look into and do these comparisons and make these choices. So I'm going to talk about the objectives. There's 10 of them, as Brett said, and then I'll turn over to Lan and she can mention some of the adaptations that are underway. And all of this is really a precursor to the survey that Alejo is going to talk in a moment, where we're hoping everybody can go online, weigh in, and state your, what are the most important things to work on here, and any other information and specifics like Brett was just talking about for recreation. So let me jump in here. I think you already touched on the goal, Brett. Overall, and again, just setting the big picture, it's to improve the long-term resilience and sustainability of Delta Islands. So of course it's, the metropolitan 4 islands, but to the extent that pilot projects, other lessons, learnings can contribute to the broader Central Delta, that's in everybody's mind who's working on here. I'm just going to pause. You can just run your eyes down that list of those 10 bullets there. Those are the 10 objectives that, so far the team has come up with. And as I said, we're working towards figuring ways of measuring and modeling some of these things. So let me just touch at a high level on each one of these here. So the first one is subsidence. As Steve said, a key project driver. It's been going on for a long time. There's the same figure that Steve just shared. This active, subsidence that's been going on for many, many decades now is reducing, the land elevation through the agricultural practices and the oxidization that goes on there. So stated as an objective, one of the things we are specifically looking at is what can we do to stop or reverse that process of subsidence. And Steve already talked about some of the adaptations that we might do. But it really, you know, we're trying to get specific about decreasing oxidation of organic and peat deposits, increasing soil formation, and ultimately that, and you'll notice as I talk through this, many of these objectives are linked together, right? So in reducing the subsidence or stopping it is part and parcel around improving the levee integrity, which is then a threat to another of our objectives, for example, water quality and supply. So for each of these, as I said, we're being specific about what we mean by it, and we're trying to come up with methodologies of how we would measure it as we consider different adaptations into the future. So that's one of the key objectives, subsidence, which is tied at the hip to greenhouse gas emissions, as Steve talked about earlier. So stated as an objective, as we start to select an island, and maybe do adaptations on and or consider different types of adaptations, to what degree will they help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? So, you know, we know over and above all the emissions that we all emit day to day, it's interesting to note, and maybe it's news to some, that these subsiding islands, just through that process of subsidence and oxidation, are emitting greenhouse gases. So there is an opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through different innovative land uses, different approaches to agriculture, you know, decreasing the oxidization, et cetera. Agriculture is obviously the primary land use currently on the 4 islands. This map from the SFEI website shows, you know, kind of the current approach. I guess this is Webb Island here. So part and parcel of moving forward with trying to achieve the other objectives is we still want to implement and maintain a sustainable agricultural system that will, frankly, when I get to the economics, will help support the economics of this and continue to pay for some of the other objectives we're trying to achieve here. So, you know, this will mean we're going to start exploring different agricultural practices. Some of those are listed there. Poluticulture, we'll talk about in a few minutes. Rice, regenerative agriculture, etc. So maintaining and, you know, continuing with the agriculture practices into the future is one of the objectives for the project. We've talked about this on the ecology front. Here's that same, you know, Webb Island, looking at it through a different lens of what is currently out there on the land. And you see it is primarily agricultural, non-native land out there, but there are pockets of different habitats types that provide different values to different, you know, ecological processes, functions, and systems. So the idea here is, moving forward, can we explore changes to different land uses, innovative practices to improve the amount of ecological habitat and function on the landscape? And we will get specific about this as we consider different adaptations for different forms of wetland development and agricultural practices themselves that can lead to different, of course, contributions to wildlife habitat, et cetera. And there's a couple of lists of some of the things we'll be considering as we go through here. I'm just going to pause from time to time in case there's any questions coming up that Alejo, you just want to make me aware of, but otherwise I'll keep moving through. So directly tied with kind of the ecology on any of these given islands is to what extent we've kind of called this broader ecological benefits. And the logic here is if we are going to evaluate different innovative land uses and activities on the different islands, to what extent can they contribute to the broader delta? So it's kind of like looking at your neighbors, looking at what's adjacent to you, habitat connectivity, those types of things from an ecological and functional perspective. Does it make sense that you could design these landscapes to get synergistic benefits with what's already out there? And as we've already said a couple of times, like increase the connectivity and contribute as an example in the Delta or a pilot project for other things that could move forward. So that whole broader benefits connectivity is something that we've started to think about. And we're exploring as we're developing this objective and its criterion. This relates to our earlier question about, to what extent are we integrating Indigenous knowledge, opportunities for, restoring eco-cultural activities and practices that used to be in place and of course still are to some extent. So we do, through our discussions, have come up with, and we framed it as eco-cultural restoration. So the gist of it is, first of all, recognizing that viewpoint of the interconnectedness of all the ecosystem, parts of the ecosystem and how they interrelate, and how that interrelates with the opportunity for revitalization of Indigenous culture. So we expect that we will be exploring, through looking at these different potential adaptations, what are the opportunities to restore more integrated traditional practices, selective plant gathering, use of fire, many of these things that have been studied, known to have been a part of the Delta for a very long time. And over and above that, as Brett mentioned, we want to tap into that knowledge source in the design of these mosaics as we move forward, and combinations of different innovative land uses to capture that opportunity and build it into the process and the potential for benefits moving forward. Recreation, another one that was talked about earlier today. We know there's a bunch of things going on out there, a lot of interest in hunting, fishing, among other things, trail use, et cetera, et cetera. So this project is saying, with all the caveats that Russ was mentioning earlier and all the challenges we might encounter, as we evaluate innovative land uses, to what extent can we increase the opportunity for recreational use, place-making opportunities to, the Delta is a vibrant place, where people live and recreate. So we will, and we do want to explore that opportunity as we move forward here. Specifically the quantity and quality of opportunities that are out there, with the features that are out there through the different exploration of land uses, et cetera. Water quality and supply. We all also know that the Delta is, a crucial part of the California water system. So again, the objective is just understanding the crucial role that these islands play and the Delta itself plays, and maintaining water quality and supply is kind of a simple statement that the team has come up with. But Steve was showing some examples earlier, and Russ too, with his video there, that some of these islands are very strategically located in terms of managing and preventing that salinity intrusion of, into the Delta. So anything that is considered under this project will be taking this into consideration and looking for opportunities to improve, if possible, any of the water quality, supply, risk and reliability benefits that these islands already present. Economics. So I think, stating frankly, some of these adaptations may be quite expensive, but some of the other opportunities, like different agricultural processes and practices, they themselves offer the opportunity to make this, and we want to explore kind of the sustainability of this. Can we come up with adaptations that pay for themselves in a simple way of saying it? So we are going to be exploring the underpinnings of the agricultural economics of the different adaptations and different approaches to agriculture that we explore. And then once we get into these mixed mosaics of, incorporating wetland areas if possible, what do those cost? How are those costs covered? all of these things are going to be part of the economics that we transparently explore here. This might seem like a bit of an unusual project objective with something so tangible of doing landscape designs, but it really has been driven by Metropolitan's guidance on this project, that fostering the opportunity to learn, like, can we come up with recommendations for pilot projects that can contribute to broader learning? And importantly, are there opportunities for partnerships and collaborations? Like these islands, you know, they are part of a broader, you know, area, the whole Delta. Are there opportunities to partner with local organizations, consider joint learning opportunities, engage with different partners on implementation? These are all the kinds of things that we are going to be exploring and want to explore as part of this project. Okay, so those were the 10 objectives. So how might we achieve some of those things, and what are some of the adaptations that we're currently have been brought to the table so far? So Alain, do you want to pick it up here and just run through some of these ideas that have come up so far from the project team?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. So this is the list of some of the ones that have been discussed and that we've been looking into so far. There may be others that are going to come up as we start actually planning the land use mosaic. Yeah, for now, I'll run through a brief description of these ones that we've been talking about. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, so the first of the kind of sustainable agriculture options that we're looking at is called pollutoculture. And what pollutoculture is wetland agriculture that's based on regularly reflooding low-lying farmlands on organic soils. So basically, it's a way of productively using wetlands that allows you to harvest biomass, but also maintains and restores the services that are provided by peatland ecosystems. So common types of vegetation that are involved in pollutoculture are usually perennial crops. So things like reeds, cattails, willows, rice, things like that. It's a fairly new and innovative practice, but there are small-scale pollutoculture pilot projects that have been happening around the world throughout Europe, Southeast Asia, and Canada as well. There's lots of potential benefits from pollutoculture. There's economic benefits as a form of sustainable agriculture. There's subsidence mitigation in the sense that the regular or the flooding of the farmlands reduces the oxidization of soils and therefore subsidence, also reduces greenhouse gas emissions. There are fish and wildlife benefits that particularly for birds and aquatic species. And finally, there is a benefit for levee stability. So basically anything that's going to mitigate or stop subsidence and also decrease hydraulic gradients throughout the levee is going to have benefits for levee stability. You can go to the next slide. Another type of sustainable agriculture that we're looking into is rice farming. So it's been shown to stop subsidence and can provide a net greenhouse gas benefit. Historically, corn and other crops that have been primarily harvested or primarily farmed in the Delta, they require a drained root zone and have been cultivated on subsided organic soils in the Delta. So have kind of contributed to increased subsidence and increased oxidization of soils. So rice farming is an interesting alternative to that. It has really similar benefits to pollutoculture in terms of reducing or reversing subsidence, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, creating fish and wildlife habitat, and improving levee stability. Another thing we're looking at is regenerative agriculture. So that is an approach to agriculture that remediates the land while doing the agriculture. So it's based on concepts like keeping living plants in the ground at all times, keeping the ground armored, using sustainable grazing or tilling practices. And the approach is intended to provide healthier soils to enhance biodiversity, prevent erosion, and provide a range of other ecosystem services. Regenerative agriculture can apply to any crops. It's more about how you grow than about what you grow. So there are a couple potential benefits. It can slow subsidence rates, but it's generally agreed that it's unlikely to actually reverse subsidence. But it also provides terrestrial wildlife habitat. So for lots of reptiles, amphibians, birds, and other terrestrial species. Delta freshwater tidal wetlands are located in areas that are hydraulically connected to delta channels. So historically, the delta contained like a much larger area of tidal wetlands than it does currently. I think there used to be about 190,000 hectares of tidal wetlands. Now there's about 4,000. So one thing we're looking at in the project is ways to potentially restore some of that area. Restoration of tidal wetlands could be achieved by converting upland or subtidal habitat into wetlands, or potentially by building setback levees. So similar to some of the other forms of sustainable agriculture, there are lots of benefits in terms of achieving the objectives of subsidence and greenhouse gas emissions reductions, wildlife benefits, and levee stability as well. Flooded managed wetlands are basically human-built wetland systems that are designed to mimic natural wetland ecosystems. They're different from tidal wetlands in that they are not at all influenced by tidal inputs, and that they are constructed within Delta Island interiors. And they can also be constructed in conjunction with agricultural land use. Again, this is an adaptation that will reverse or mitigate at least subsidence, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, have benefits for wildlife, and improve levee stability. Finally, there's a kind of a category of adaptations around infrastructure and levee improvements, and that's basically generally reflecting that there's a range of infrastructure or levee improvements that can be made, such as setback levees or general improvements to levee stability that can have benefits across a couple of objectives. So reducing the risk of levee failure, and if there were levee failure, then impacts to water supply reliability. And also there are potential recreation benefits because levees can be used for trails and other recreational features.
Great, thanks, Lan. Yeah, so just to wrap this up, Brett, and I'll pass it over to you in case questions have come in. Just a reminder, I think you're still seeing my screen here. So we kind of walked through pretty quickly what these objectives are. We've got words around them all. We've got sheets on the website with these evaluation criteria, how we're actually thinking of measuring, scoring some of these things. And eventually, as Alan said, walking through all those different innovative land uses adaptations, we're going to be combining them into mosaics and comparing them and working toward matrices like this that kind of explain and explore it all. So that's kind of the path the project is on. Brett, I'll hand it to you in case there's questions before Alejo sends it over to the survey where we want people to weigh in on this.
Yeah, no, I'm not. Thank you, Dan and Alon. I'm not seeing any open questions at the moment. And so we just have one last relatively short presentation, which is Alejo is going to demonstrate how to use the survey. I mean, it's pretty easy to use, but just in case not, we're just going to walk you through it a little bit like live so you can see how it works. And again, everything that Dan and Alon just talked about looking at those objectives, weighing in on them, whether if it's, talking about what type of recreation or any and overall what you think is more important or less important in these 10 objectives. That is what the survey is really trying to get more information from you, the public. So please fill it out. So Alejo, do you want to go ahead?
So I just sent the link to the survey once more if you want to follow along. This is the first page. So introductory text kind of gives a more succinct background. We'll then be asking for some demographic information. So providing a home zip code, age, primary identification, and also your connection to the Delta. Then we'll quickly go over the project objectives and the survey format. And then we'll have a page dedicated to each project objective. So this one is actually a grouping of stopping and reversing subsidence and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And information will be presented related to that objective. And then there will be some follow-up questions related to that objective. There are also questions that are in the format of a draw button feature. So I will just quickly show how that is done. These draw on map questions, you will click this button. It'll bring you just to the full map screen. And if you wanted to draw out a polygon, you would just do it like this. To complete the polygon, you click where you started. Once you've completed some of these questions, you will be prompted to answer a kind of follow-up question. So here it's asking what type of agriculture would you like to see in that specified polygon. So I'll say regenerative agriculture. There's also a related point-based question where you just drop a point on the map and again will be prompted to answer a question. So I'm just going to quickly go through the last couple pages of the survey. And there is a lot of information contained in the survey by way of background. Some objective pages don't have any questions, such as fostering ecocultural restoration in indigenous place. However, as we will see later, there will be an opportunity to rank all of the different objectives. Here's a question that is ranking preferences for different potential recreational opportunities. And you'll just see that's how you would fill that drop choice question out. More of these map-based questions that I showed earlier. Just going to zoom through this here now. So yes, this is the ranking of the objectives, and we really would appreciate your input here to get a sense of how important all of the different objectives, different 10 objectives are. And objectives can have equal rank. You know, if you do nothing here and submit, we'll just assume that all the objectives are equally important. But if you really wanted to elevate a certain one, such as reducing greenhouse gas emissions or improving regional and Delta-wide benefits, you would slide the slider here. If you think something is less important, such as sustainable project economics, for example, you would slide the slider to the left. And then we have one final page of closing questions. And then when you click done here, the survey will be submitted. So we really would appreciate your help completing what is a very comprehensive survey, and that once you've completed it, you submit it through this done button here.
Leo, before you hit done,
I will not press done.
could you go back to recreation? We had a lot of folks asking about recreation. Could you maybe just walk through as to, like, I know you did it partially, but I think it would just be really helpful so people get that they're weighing which type and whatever, because there's been some concerns about that, you know.
This page here?
I think it was the page before that. We kind of flipped through it fast. Is that
This
just
one.
that one? Yeah, keep going. Yeah,
Yeah.
So if you could just talk about that a little bit, I think it'd be helpful.
Yeah, so we're presenting ways that we've formulated of assessing recreation and placemaking opportunities, and those have to do with access and proximity to urban areas, vulnerable communities that are more vulnerable, are experiencing high levels of vulnerability. But there may be other ways. So there's a question here. Do you agree with these ways of assessing recreation and placemaking opportunity? You can agree. You can also disagree. And we are also asking for additional ways that we might assess public recreational opportunities across the island, and would really appreciate input on that.
Thank you.
Any other questions coming up? Okay. Well, seeing none, yeah, just one final plug to participate in this survey, and yeah. So Brett, should I take it back to you?
Yeah, I think we can go ahead. You can probably stop sharing your screen. I do think we have a question here. It says, Delta Tunnel route is being considered that would go through some of these islands as an alternative in the upcoming draft EIR. Though this is apparently not the currently preferred route, how will this process take that potential future land use and accompanying impacts into account? I think I can partially answer that, you know, there's so much contingency about tunnels, now the tunnel, maybe no tunnel. We are trying to be aware and cognizant of that process and where it is going, knowing that at this point, nobody really knows exactly what's going to happen with that. There is a potential that it would go beneath one of these islands, which then it would have to be, that would factor in, obviously, because then there'd be an intake and things like that. So it's out there. It's not really something we can know or count on as an entity within this design, because these tunnels have been up in the air for years. But it is possible that it would intersect with that.
Oh, and I'll add to that. It is the Delta, I think it's called the Delta Conveyance Project, is not part of this grant process. I want to make that perfectly clear. We do not consider that's a whole separate process. And like Brett said, I mean, we know where it is. It's in the EIS phase. And anything I say beyond that is pure speculation, because I'm not involved in that process at all. So obviously we would take a look at it, you know, if it came to a situation that we had to, but at this point, we're not considering it.
We are done with all our presentations, so it's really an open forum. If you want to raise your hand and ask a question rather than post something, or if you have a comment, it doesn't have to be a question. If you have a general comment you want to say, we can pretty much open it up to that at this point. Alejo, I take it you can see if somebody's raising their hand.
I can.
And if someone does have a comment, the purpose of this is to receive input. So it's best, I mean, obviously there's obvious answers, just the easy questions, but we'd really like to hear from you. I think this part of it is to receive your input, and we would document it accordingly.
Yeah, thank you, Russ. I think Kurt Schmoody has his hand up.
Are you able to unmute him, Brett?
I'm trying. Alejo, can you unmute Kurt?
Kurt should be unmuted.
Okay, Kurt, can you hear?
Hand, yeah, hand was up by mistake, sorry.
Oh,
Comic relief. Thank you, Kurt. Gilbert Cosio has his hand up, I see.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. Gilbert Cosio, River Delta Consulting. I understand that you guys aren't in charge of prioritizing levy spending, but I think you can provide information that would help the people that are going to prioritize it, like the Stewardship Council, in a couple of ways. One, you can put a value on habitat and Delta's place so that when they throw it into their risk calculation, they know what the consequences are. Right now, that's the big missing factor is what the Stewardship Council's investment strategy is. They haven't valued that. So I think that's one way that this could answer some of those questions and help with their priority study that they're going to do. And the second thing is when we went through the first levy investment strategy with the Stewardship Council, we wrestled a lot with ability to pay. And I think you guys could put together, based on the mixed agriculture and habitat and whatnot, what ability can these islands come up with? Because that's the key. How do you maintain these islands based on that farming income that's coming off these things? So I think you could probably help out in that regard too. And the last thing is, the Delta's place, there's the main factor is the agricultural economy. So you have to determine what is the critical mass of agriculture that has to stay in place in order to keep the Delta as an evolving place. Otherwise, it's gone, because that is what keeps the levees up. You lose your levees, you lose all your habitat, you lose everything. So that's going to be the key is maybe you could define that sort of thing. Hey, to keep the Delta as an evolving place, you've got to have a critical mass of some sort of economic base that would continue on for whatever years you need to sustain. Thank you.
Yeah, I would respond, Gilbert. Those are great comments. As you know, Gilbert, you and I have talked on several levels with regards to the levies. We will receive those comments. I know there's an economic piece to this, so we will consider that as we move forward. But yeah, very good comments and well received.
And I think that's one thing I maybe didn't mention in my intro survey or talk, that we are trying to stay abreast of all of these other planning initiatives that are going on, levy investment, Delta adapts and things like that. So we are trying to be very aware of those other things that are going on as we push forward.
I would also add that there, like Brett presented the schedule before, there's a couple opportunities to input. This is not the only opportunity. And obviously, if you go home or think of something tomorrow, feel free to email us through the site, the website. You can comment through that or email any one of us, and we will put that into the consideration box and talk about it.
We do have a couple questions here. This is an ecology one, and I guess I should also mention many of our TAC members are on the call. So if they can raise their hands to answer these questions too as they come up, please do chime in. This one is about habitat restoration. I think the questions about where habitat restoration should take place are tough without greater detail on fishery migration, bird migration, etc. Greater detail would help us drill down. Can you do a map with more detail on anticipated outcomes? Doesn't this type of work involve really site-specific decisions for best management? Steve, did you want to answer that question, or did anybody on the TAC want to have a take on that question?
Is Steve there?
Yes.
think if I could just jump in quickly on this, and I'm not an ecologist on this by any means, but it hints at one of the things we've been working with as a project team, that we're in a project with 2 phases. So we've got these objectives like ecological habitat restoration as one of them. And our first phase of the project is to select which island to work on. So that's a pretty high level comparison of these islands. And we need a certain level of, detail in the information that we pull together to do that. But I think this is hinting at, once we get down to that designing mosaics of land use opportunities, like how specific are we going to be able to get? What data sources are we going to be using to really look at creating wetland habitats here, or different types of agriculture there that provide seasonal migratory bird habitat that fits in well, that kind of thing. I think the question seems to be getting at, to do the kind of detailed planning that the second phase of the project really implies, and to do a good job of it. How detailed, how far are we going to drill down on it, I guess. So I don't know who's best to speak to that, but I know there's an intention to.
I could just add a little bit to that. I agree that the ecological benefits really need to be more fully analyzed in the second phase, where we're doing the mosaic. But we are going through a process right now where we're trying to really quantify and have a better handle on how to assess those benefits. So it's a process that's ongoing to kind of get weigh in on a criteria sheet or criteria evaluation that Jennifer Bird from GEI put together, and hopefully the TAC members can weigh in on that to look at the 4 different islands and decide what makes the most sense where. And I think that's a beginning, because then we can begin to look at what factors we really need to look at, and then move forward with the mosaic in terms of having a better sense of what's important, what the priorities are. Because that's where the SFEI landscape tool comes in as well. There is a capability to look at that in terms of connectivity and with adjacent habitats and such, and also experience on other islands in terms of what makes the most sense from a migrating wildfowl standpoint and that kind of thing. So I think that's the overall process.
Yeah, I was going to offer out to kind of where you ended up, Steve, talking about other islands. Statton's a good example how they're learning lessons, different types of adaptation that we're considering too in this planning process for Met's properties. So that's something we're clued into. We've got TNC as one of the stakeholder members, so they're providing input into that as well.
Yeah, so I guess two sort of summary points there. I think that it's very much in flux in terms of amongst the TAC and things in deciding this. And I think you also see it in the 2 objectives, where we have the larger Delta wide, which is looking at some of those larger migration corridors, patterns like that, versus then the more, I think what like the site specific is the island itself. And when we start to try to figure out what land use is where, what mix, or how big of one or how small of another. So I think those are still very much in process. So, and I think Stephen Kafka has his hands up. Vallejo, if you can unmute him.
Is that working? Can you hear me, Brett?
Yep, go ahead.
I'd just like to add that a lot of the things that are being proposed would have to be tried out empirically and would be subject to a kind of a development process. For example, the concept of polluticulture is very exciting, but it's untried and under Delta conditions. Once we're done with this technical advisory committee process, there'll be subsequent work that'll have to go forward that involve all kinds of actors, the general public, I'm sure. So
Yeah, that's a good point, Steve. I appreciate you saying that because this polluticulture, we've got a lot of ideas about polluticulture. We've tried to move them forward in one way or another, but most of the work's been done in other countries at this point. There is, I would say that the data collected so far indicates a net greenhouse gas benefit, subsidence reversal potential, and conservation of peatlands. But just, the harvesting of wetland biomass, getting machinery in and out and all that is something that really needs to be worked out at a pilot scale. And that is a part of this process where we would design a pilot project. Hopefully that gets off the ground at some point.
Yeah, I would add to that too, in the sense of testing. That's one of a possible outcome to identifying opportunities could be to test that. And, that's what we're trying to get our hands around so that we can get answers so that in the long term, we could set up a prioritization down the road based on more informed scientific knowledge base that has been tested.
Sort of a related question in the questions says, to what extent are you considering using some of these wetlands for conducting applied research for recovering declining native species such as Delta smelt?
And the next question is related to that specifically as well. Like the
Okay.
Delta smelt, is it within the grant scope to consider restoration opportunities outside of the levees?
Well, Steve, do you want to take the Delta smelt question?
I'll give it a shot. So there is quite a few different moving parts here. One is there is a movement afoot to create Delta smelt rearing habitat on Metropolitan's Island. So that would be considered as part of the mosaic for Bolden Island if that was the island chosen. And so part and parcel with that is trying to look at how we might provide a food web benefit in that kind of situation. One of the things we've proposed and are looking at as well is this idea of floating marshes. We've made some progress in experimenting with that and demonstrated the food web benefit on Bolden Island and some mesocosms, also known as doughboy pools. And we've tried to also quantify the greenhouse gas emissions and what kind of benefit they would bring. So there is this, I would say, interweaving of Delta smelt rearing habitat with floating peat marshes and permanently flooded wetlands as well to provide a food web benefit. I don't see, and so part of that might be to have a setback level where you might float peats, or in the case of Holland, a track where you've got higher elevations that you might build up over time with permanently flooded wetlands. It would become tidal habitat. So those are, I don't think we're thinking so much about constructing anything outside of levees, but certainly the food web benefit within the levees, once it's hydraulically connected, could be an export of food web into the delta. So.
Great. Next question we have here. The problem a bit for me, this Barbara is following up on an earlier question about where to locate the wetlands. Wanted to comment on best use without that detail. We want to get this right. I guess that's what I'm saying. So maybe the question is a little premature for the community, but appreciate that you're asking this up front. I think if you notice in there, we had that same thought that if you don't know, we wanted to let you say, I don't know where it should go. And we're, again, trying to get a very broad public. So we're thinking this might be residents, this might be people who have no real ecological knowledge about the Delta, to all of our technical people across the state who've looked at this extensively. So we're trying to offer that realm. And don't feel like if you don't know, you don't have to indicate it. And we will record that as well, how many people actually said, I don't know, because we think that's important too. So thanks for the question. I think we've got them all. Please raise your hand if you have a question, or if we missed your question, or if you have another one you'd like to ask.
There is a good question here related to
chat.
methane emissions. Don't forget to consider methane emissions from the wetland restoration and similar activities. Yeah, that's a good point. There's been pretty extensive data collection effort using eddy covariance and Delta that has quantified the methane emissions from wetlands. I think we have a pretty good handle on that, although we are continuing to measure those fluxes in our floating wetlands, for example. So that is brought into the equation when we calculate the net benefit of converting lands to wetlands. The issue really is the baseline emission. So, for example, on Bolden Island, there's been a baseline CO2 emission on the order of about 20 tons of CO2 per acre per year. You could add to that the nitrous oxide emissions that have been measured out there recently, which increase that by about 25%. So you're looking at a pretty substantial greenhouse gas emission on Bolden Island. I'm using that as an example. So you take the data from wetlands that includes methane emissions as well as the carbon sequestration, you have a net greenhouse gas effect on the order of plus or minus a ton of CO2 per acre per year. So the net over time, now this based on the methane atmospheric reactions and such, you really need to leave that wetland in place for decades. And so provided you created a wetland and left it for decades on that highly organic soil in the middle of Bolden Island that's emitting, 20 plus tons of CO2 per acre per year, you're going to have a substantial net benefit over time. So the methane is taken into account. And there's ongoing measurements of methane, and there'll probably be more as well. Frances Coates has her hand up.
Yeah. Speak. What are you interested in? I'm an advocate for public access, and it simply is true that the public has a right to be on state, including local agency-owned land to fish. And I recognize that there are a lot of no trespassing signs and locked gates on apparently on district-owned land in the Delta, and that's a problem for you. That it's a problem for the public who can't go there to fish, even though they're supposed to be entitled to. But it's a shoe waiting to drop as far as you're concerned. It's a very clear law. It's got very clear case law. It's just sitting there. How do you get away with putting up no trespassing signs, blocking people from access for fishing? It's beyond me.
I thank you, Francis, for your comment and your words on that. That's something that we'll have our legal department take a look at. Since you did bring up the legal law in this. So, it's something we consider, but thank you for your comment.
Francis, I'd also, I hope you fill out our survey and maybe tell us where would be the best spots to have fishing access? Where should we try to plan for that? Or, where would bank fishing be best? And because one of our objectives here is to try to increase recreational opportunities as part of the project. So if there's ways that you can guide us, I know your question is probably to the whole thing, but if there's ways that you can say where it might have the most value and things, that's something we can try to bring into what we're trying to plan for.
Well, I guess if I still have your attention, that I didn't walk in the room with a loaf of bread to bargain away half and call myself successful. The state-owned land is available for public fishing unless it's being used by the government for a purpose incompatible with public fishing, for example, a prison or a mental hospital. That basically, as far as I can tell, the shores of Delta Islands are supposed to be open unless you have one really, really good reason to have them closed that I don't know about. And that's, but I'll send some more information your way so you have something to refer to your legal office. Thanks.
Thanks, Francis.
Anybody else? I'm not seeing any hands. Am I missing anything, Alejo? I'm not sure if you're seeing any. I think that's it.
Looks like we're pretty close to the time.
Oh, right on time. Okay. Well, thank you, all of you who are still out there, all 59 of you who are still listening. Thank you for joining us for this, and please do take the survey. That is how we will know what you think and your opinions. And we will post this on our website. So if you want to go back and refer to it, it'll be there. And yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for your comments.
Thanks, everybody. Have a nice evening.
Yeah, likewise.